Well, this war started up in 1754 in western Pennsylvania, and it began as a land dispute between the British colony Virginia and France. See, because Virginia claimed all of western Pennsylvania and the Ohio country for themselves, but the French had already been there and active in that area for about a decade or two. And by 1754, France had fortified what is today downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the fort they constructed there, called Fort Duquesne, blocked Virginia's westward expansion. So Virginia decided to raise an army and send it out to Pennsylvania. And along the way, the commanding officer died, and it left a 22-year-old kid with no military experience whatsoever in charge. And this young man, you probably never heard of before, named George Washington. He continued leading the troops west, and he decided he's going to take an advanced scout ahead of the army in late May of 1754. And as they advanced west, they discovered a small group of French soldiers who were camped about 20 miles east of the French fort. Washington decided these guys are a threat, all 38 of them. So he surrounded their camp, and as the French began to wake up on the morning of May 28th, he ordered his soldiers to open fire. And this led to a war. Fighting very quickly spread all the way to Nova Scotia in Canada, and all the way down into what is today South Carolina within just a few months. You head into the right here. Now, the fighting that started here in North America had spread to Central America, the Caribbean islands, it spread to Europe as far east as Russia, it spread to West Africa, India, and even the Philippines in the Pacific. So George Washington accidentally started a world war. It kind of catapulted him onto the world scene. Not the most positive way. But with all of that going on all around the globe, where we are now was the frontier of North Carolina at the time. Now, if we had been standing on this hilltop when those shots rang out in May of 54, within 10 miles of us, there were only about 30 families living out here. So this place is being settled by fairly recent immigrants, and these people are coming down from Pennsylvania, and they're venturing to North Carolina's frontier because there is tons of land available, and it's insanely inexpensive. Poor people can buy hundreds of acres for very little money. And this is a big draw. And one of the interesting things is that these people are mostly farmers, along with some tradesmen. Very few of them hunt, and very few of them owned weapons. Maybe 1 in 5 families had a gun. And that's not a problem until September of 1754, when the first attacks in western North Carolina occurred at the hands of French allied Native Americans. The Shawnee and Miami from Ohio began attacking parts of western North Carolina as well as Virginia. And this spreads panic. You know, they're falling on a population who are scattered on little farms miles apart and mostly unarmed. So these attacks led the royal governor of North Carolina, a guy named Arthur Dobbs, to raise a company of 50 soldiers to defend the frontier. He actually wanted a lot more than that, but the General Assembly, who controlled the finances, wouldn't give them to him. But those 50 soldiers, who are full-time soldiers, they came to this hilltop in the summer of 1755 to establish a base camp. And they picked this spot because we're about halfway between Virginia and South Carolina. And we're right on the edge of the frontier, but not beyond settlement. This hill, however, had something very important that most didn't. It has a spring, about 300 yards that way. So that nearby water source provides them with something they need desperately, because otherwise you've got to travel about 600-700 yards for water. Well, late in 1755, Governor Dobbs decided, because there's no forts on the frontier of North Carolina, he decided these guys need a fort, and he ordered them to start building what he designed and very cleverly named for himself, Fort Dobbs. The soldiers started building it in about December of 1755, and it was completed by the end of October of 56. Took them less than a year. Now, what they've built is a gigantic blockhouse. It's a 3-story structure made of big oak logs, and it's going to serve as their living quarters. Of course, it's a building they can defend, but it's also a place where locals can seek refuge, and it's a big supply depot. Now, this fort had 3 storage areas in it. Below ground, under that half of the building over there was a cellar, and that's used primarily for food storage. In the back corner of the cellar, there was a small round room, and that's the powder magazine where all the gunpowder was safely stored. And then you have this space. This room is both storage area and workshop, and a little bit of an office. But the most important stuff in here are the contents of the big barrels. Most adults' first guess is booze, and that's not correct. So these soldiers are what are called provincial soldiers. They're North Carolinians, but they are part of the British military system. And North Carolina was copying the British Army, and one of the things they copied is the rations. Every single day, each man is going to get issued 1 pound of meat, 1 pound of bread, about 1.5 cups of either rice or peas, about 1/4 cup of butter. They also get oatmeal and coffee, a little bit of vinegar, and 4 ounces of either rum or whiskey a day. But they're also expected to keep gardens so they can grow fresh vegetables to supplement their meals. These guys are getting about 3,500 calories each day. It's a lot, but they're working hard, and they don't have any labor laws. Today we have that nice 8-hour work day, 5 days a week. They worked sun up to sundown 7 days a week. Guys need a lot of energy. Now, in addition to food, we need water to survive. And that first water source was decided that it wasn't a great ideal one, because that's a long way to travel for water. And if we came under attack, you can get cut off. So the soldiers dug a well inside of the fort. In 1968, archaeologists had been working out here for about 3 years, and they decided that it was time to see what was in the bottom of the well. So they started digging it out, just like the soldiers did 260 some years ago. A man was lowered down by rope with a bucket and a shovel. And the well turned out to be a good 4.5 feet in diameter and 41.5 feet deep. Down at the bottom of the well, once excavated, the archaeologists found the remains of a pulley, parts of a broken bucket. There were a bunch of charred timbers, but it also had about 4.5 feet of water that filled into it. Right up until the day we started reconstructing the fort, that well was open, and we could still get water out of it. Now we can't, because it was decided for safety reasons to cap it. We didn't want people dropping cell phones or little kids in it. Just bad publicity. So, now, do you guys have questions so far? No? Okay.
How often did they get shipments of supplies and stuff?
We have no idea. The records like that didn't survive. But we do know that they had cattle and hogs, because they're butchering animals on site. We know that through the archaeology. A lot of the food is going to be, like the grains and stuff, is going to be locally sourced from farmers. Rice and peas were probably imported, but we don't know exactly how often, because it is only 50 guys here typically, so they're not going to be running through it super fast. Now, one of the main purposes of the structure is to serve as a living quarters for the guys. And this is a barracks room. And we believe there were 4 barracks rooms in the original fort. And each one of these is going to serve as the full living quarters for 12 men. And this is very obviously a bedroom. There's 6 bunks. They're sleeping 2 to a bunk. But it is far more than just a bedroom. These guys did not have a cook who prepared meals for the entire fort each day. Instead, soldiers are broken up into small groups called messes. Mess was typically 6 guys. Every single day, each mess got issued its food, and every day, 1 guy from each mess would be the cook for the day. So we would see 2 guys working over a fire preparing meals in the kitchen part of the barracks. It's your dining room, it's your living room, your repair shop, and your weapons locker. This is where you would get to live with 11 of your very close friends for about a year at a time. It is not a big space. And
that's a pretty, I mean, the bed's actually this wide for them?
Oftentimes, yeah. It's pretty sizable. It's a heck of a lot better than what they would be dealing with if they were in tents. Typically, you get 6 guys. That mess was issued a tent. Tents were about 7 feet by 7 feet, and 5 guys were expected to sleep in it at a time. Yeah, so a 4.5 foot wide bed for 2 is pretty spacious and luxurious.
Oh, so it was like 2 people and.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So, sorry, I was thinking like one each. Okay.
Oh no! It's two per bunk.
Okay.
You know, and that has its benefits, especially when it's colder out, because every single guy got a wool blanket, so you're dealing with 2 wool blankets on each bed, plus shared body heat. It allows you to stay pretty comfortable even when it's incredibly cold out.
And especially if you got one person who's probably not working as much as the others, and they still got the 3,000 calorie, so we probably put up a lot of body heat. So,
Yeah, you want that guy as your bunk mate.
Yeah.
Not during the summer months, though.
No. One of the cool things about this structure, we didn't realize it until the reconstruction was completed. All the weather here pretty much comes from the south. There's almost a constant breeze, and if we open all the loopholes and windows on the upper floors, even when it's over 100 here, this building doesn't get really much above 80.
Oh.
It's surprising. I mean, it is still stifling at 80 degrees in here, but it's much more pleasant than outside.
Yeah. But I imagine like if you got like a bunch of people in the same time, like a 50, it'd probably go up a little bit.
Yeah. It's we periodically we host living history events, and we will bring reenactors in for a weekend. And I can tell you from personal experience, by Sunday morning, you're pretty done with this. It gives a little appreciation for what those men endured. Are you guys interested in learning about the weapons?
Yeah,
A
sure.
little bit.
Okay.
Well, before you get to that, though, question.
Yeah.
I know that they had their rations and stuff, but was there any documentation of like how they prepared their rations?
There's a
though, or-
lot of documentation about that. From this period specifically, there's a corporal who named Corporal Dodd, Corporal Todd, excuse me. He actually served in Europe, but he was a British infantryman, and he gave a very detailed description of mess cooking and the food that was prepared and the differences between guys who'd been doing it for a while and guys who were brand new at it, and the razzing they got for making crap food. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting read. He left a memoir of his time during the 7 Years' War in Europe, and he was just a corporal. And so you get a really like low level experience. It's pretty neat. And evidently, these guys with a little bit of experience were cooking really good meals, even though most of it's just soups and stews. I guess you learn to make do with what you've got and produce something good.
I know, right?
I'm sorry?
I know, right?
Yeah. So North Carolinians didn't own a lot of guns, and the colony didn't either. In fact, we pretty much got rid of almost all of our guns right when the war broke out, because North Carolina raised 400 troops immediately and sent them off to Western Maryland to help Virginia with the war effort. Because we were then stuck with no weapons but needing to defend the colony, Governor Dobbs asked King George II for guns. And he very graciously sent North Carolina 1,000 stands of arms. A stand of arms consisted of a musket. Each musket came with a bayonet and a carriage, as well as a cartridge box to hold ammunition and a narrow leather belt so you can wear all that stuff around your waist. Now, the guns we received were not British guns. They were actually Dutch. In the 18th century, the Dutch were massive arms manufacturers. England had bought tens of thousands of these things in 1741. And they did that so if one of their colonies, like Virginia, starts a war that nobody's equipped to fight, these can be passed out like candy. So we get 1,000. Now, even though it's Dutch, it functions exactly the same way as a British gun. And the Brits actually pretty much copied them. There's a lot of similarities cosmetically. Now, it is a flintlock, meaning it uses flint and steel, a piece of stone and metal to fire. This metal plate is the lock. Inside, there's a bunch of gears and springs. This piece is your cock, and in its jaws, it has a piece of flint. Flint is a stone that's mined in England. They can also be mined in France, and it can be sharpened to a point that it can cut metal. Then you have this piece, that's your battery, which serves as the steel. You've got your barrel, there's a ramrod under the barrel, and your stock. To load and fire the weapons, the soldiers were actually issued cartridges. Cartridge is a tube of paper that contains a bullet or musket ball at the bottom and a pre-measured amount of gunpowder on the top. Soldiers would be trained to take one of these out of their cartridge box. You rip the top off with your teeth, pour a little bit of the gunpowder into that pan, shut the pan, turn the gun around, put the rest of the charge down the barrel with the ball on top, draw the ramrod out, ram the cartridge down, put the ramrod back, and then it's ready to shoot. British soldiers get a lot more training than these guys, and in fact, they typically see about a year of training before they ever would step foot on a battlefield. And they are expected to be able to do that process, pull the trigger, and hit a target in 15 seconds. It's 4 shots in a minute. These guys are expected to do about 3 shots a minute, so 20 seconds for the process. One of the things that historians and even Hollywood get really, really wrong is the ability of these weapons to hit targets. The guns aren't the problem. It's human beings that are the problem. Even in 15 seconds, these guys, they're expected to be able to hit a target at 100 yards in training. The gun does come with a rear sight and a front sight. Those things don't work if you don't use them, right? And so the soldiers are actually trained to stand with their feet apart, lean forward on the left foot, bring the gun up to the shoulder, tuck it in nice and tight, close your left eye, place your cheek against the stock, and take specific aim down the barrel. And when you pull that trigger, the flint hits the battery, scraping off pieces of metal, dropping sparks into the pan, igniting that powder, sending a fire into the breech, igniting the powder in the breech, and throwing the musket ball down range. And these guns are 80 caliber. So it's throwing a ball that's about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. It's about an ounce of lead. And like I said,
That's gonna hurt.
yep, and you can hit a target at 100 yards with no problem in training. I've been playing with these things for 30 years. It's not hard to do with a little practice. In combat, when lead starts flying at an individual, it becomes much harder to take aim at something because your adrenaline spikes. You tend to flinch when musket balls whiz past your head. Modern infantry have, if you've served, you may know you don't hit your target as often as, as you would in training. Now, 20 seconds is a very long time to reload, okay? A human being can cover a lot of distance in 20 seconds. And this battlefield, unlike what Hollywood portrays, is not full of soldiers that stand shoulder to shoulder. both during this war and even the American Revolution, the British Army figured out if you do that, everybody dies in very large numbers very rapidly. So they spread their soldiers out. So in this war, you're typically not standing any closer than 3 feet apart. Officers can change that to out to 15 feet if they want. And on the battlefield, these guys are not walking, they run. And like I said, in 20 seconds, a human being can cover a lot of distance. If it looked like the enemy was going to get close, these guys would put 7 buckshot like that on top of the musket ball. And that load is called buck and ball, and you're now firing a giant shotgun that's spraying 8 lead projectiles out. It is a really nasty load, and it hurts like crazy to fire. That's a lot of lead. And yeah, it does. You're going to hit multiple targets because it's exiting the barrel in about a 15-degree spread. And that happy note, you guys have questions?
No, it's pretty good.
Okay, cool. Well, you ready to head upstairs?
Yeah.
All right. So, like I said, there's we believe that there were 4 barracks rooms in the original Fort Dobbs. And so you've also got a storage room, as well as what we're going into, an officer's quarters. The officers that served at Fort Dobbs are guys who are from the upper classes of society, and they're appointed by the crown, or by the governor. There's typically 3 officers and a surgeon serving here. The guy that commanded this fort through most of its existence was a very young man. His name was Hugh Waddell. He grew up in Northern Ireland and moved to North Carolina in 1753 when he was 19. Remember I mentioned that North Carolina sent 400 troops to Western Maryland? Mm-hmm. He was a lieutenant in that command. And within 2 months of serving up there, he was promoted to captain. As a 20-year-old captain, he commanded a company of approximately 100 soldiers. It's a pretty good amount of responsibility. And he did such a good job, Governor Dobbs selected him to come back to North Carolina, and he was given command of the frontier company, the 50 soldiers that came to this hilltop in the summer of 1755. And it sounds like a demotion, because he's going from commanding 100 to just 50, but he's holding the same rank, same pay rate. However, in Maryland, he was part of an army of close to 1,000. Here, he's got 50 guys, and that's it. His nearest support, it's going to take 3.5 weeks for news to reach them that there's a problem, okay? He's also given the responsibility of keeping close to 2,000 families safe who are scattered over almost 8,000 square miles, and he has 50 soldiers to keep them safe with. He's given an impossible task. He's also placed in charge of getting the fort built. He is, by February of 1756, he's in charge of Native American diplomacy for North Carolina as well. He, along with 2 Virginia delegates and a Mohawk Indian, managed to broker a deal with the Catawba, who still have a reservation in South Carolina, and the Cherokee, who still have land in western North Carolina. They got those 2 nations to agree to stop fighting each other, because they've been at war for a couple decades, and agree to work together to help North Carolina and Virginia defend their frontiers.
Nice.
He was 21. Makes me feel like a failure. He was pretty rapidly promoted, and by the end of the war, he was a colonel in 1761, commanding a regiment of 450 soldiers out in the frontier, far frontier. And he was also additionally in charge of close to 3,000 militia, though most of them aren't armed and they're not all serving at the same time. But he is in charge of all of that. Guy was pretty talented. And as cool as he was, my favorite person to actually serve at Fort Dobbs was its 2nd doctor. In the 18th century, to become a doctor, you had to go to medical school. In medical school, other doctors will teach you anatomy, you learn how to make and administer medicine, you learn how to conduct surgeries, hopefully stave off infections, but they're also learning about cancers. They learn how to identify and treat some types of cancer back then. You typically graduate around 20 to 22 years old, and then you go and serve a residency under other doctors. Well, Fort Dobbs' second doctor was a man named John Fergus. He graduated from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland at 16 as a surgeon. His residency was on the battlefield. At 17, he was helping to save the lives of soldiers wounded in combat. And at 18, he was not legally old enough to own land, and he was the surgeon here. We know through pension applications that he saved the lives of a number of soldiers who were horrifically wounded in combat. One man named Robert Campbell was shot twice through the body, about a mile from here. His right elbow was shattered with a musket ball. He was hit in the shoulder with an axe, and he was scalped. The guy managed to crawl the mile back to the fort, and this 18-year-old surgeon saved that guy's life. He lived old enough to collect a pension. It's a pretty impressive outcome, for a kid who's not old enough to hold land. Both John Fergus and Hugh Waddell have web pages. You can go to NCPD and actually look up their complete biographies. They're pretty fascinating. Now, the third floor of the fort would have been 2 more barracks rooms, but today we have modern building and fire codes, so it's pretty much just sealed off. It would have looked a lot like this. Now, we're going to step into here. This is a flanker. Remember, the well is down on the first floor here. There is a mirror of this off the officers' quarters, and these 2 rooms combined are the defensive heart of the fort. Each of the 6 windows in here would have had a small cannon like that mounted in it. These things are very creatively named. It's called a swivel gun because it swivels. They're very creative in the 18th century. It's also called a half-pounder because at long range you're capable of firing a half-pound solid iron ball. 2 guys should be able to load and fire that in about 40 seconds. And within a couple shots, they should be able to place an iron ball through one of the windows of that blue house, almost 300 yards away across the street. That, however, is not very efficient. It's not effective ammunition because at long range, you're shooting at human beings who move around and don't like to get shot at. So it's not very effective. But the other munition this gun fires is a little package of 12 musket balls called grape shot. And this is, at that point, a gigantic shotgun. We have archaeologically recovered grape shot about 220 yards from the fort. And those rounds were fired, we believe, during a battle. The battle that was fought here was, unfortunately, was between former allies. In 1758, the Cherokee were such close friends with the colonies in Britain that they sent almost 700 warriors to Pennsylvania to help the British Army and the colonists capture Fort Duquesne, that French fort that stood in what is today downtown Pittsburgh. The campaign was successful. The fort was, the point was taken, the fort was destroyed, and a new fort was built there. But as the Cherokee were returning home, in September of 1758, Virginia civilians, militia, just a hair north of Roanoke, Virginia, started ambushing returning parties of Cherokee. And over the course of 2 weeks, they managed to murder about 40 of their allies. And we do not know exactly why this occurred, but it upset the Cherokee. Native Americans in the 18th century had their very own justice system. It's a little different than European justice methods. When a native person is murdered, the warriors of that person's town were bound. They must go and seek balance in life justice by taking an eye for an eye, a life for a life. In April and May of 1759, because Virginia would not do anything about the murders, the Cherokee retaliated and they took the lives of approximately 40 settlers. Except instead of attacking Virginia, they did it in North Carolina. Most of them were along the Catawba and the Yadkin rivers, within 40 miles of here. The reason they attacked North Carolina instead of Virginia, see, the Cherokee looked at all of these British colonies as one nation. So we're all one people in Cherokee eyes. 40 lives here is the same as 40 there. It's just a shorter trip. Once they did it, they thought, okay, we have justice. We are even. Life is in balance between us, and that means we can be friends again. And to prove it, they began attacking the French all over again, and in some cases, their warriors were traveling as far west as what is today modern St. Louis, Missouri. That's a massive display of renewed friendship. And while they're off doing this, the governor of South Carolina decided he's going to get involved with the murders, and he demanded that the Cherokee turn over every single warrior who participated in the attacks on North Carolina so they could be executed. And the Cherokee, no, that's not justice, because that would be hundreds of warriors. And so they refused, and the governor backed down a little bit. He demanded in this time 80 warriors to be executed by South Carolina. And the Cherokee response was to refuse again, because that would put them far behind, right? Now, instead of reacting violently to this request, the Cherokee chose to send 38 chiefs to Charleston, South Carolina, to talk with the governor. And they're trying to prevent any further bloodshed. The governor ended up taking those guys hostage and marching an army with the threat of attacking the Cherokee towns and killing men, women, and children until 80 warriors were turned over. The army marched west. He placed those 38 chiefs in a jail cell in Fort Prince George. It's a fort that stood not far from Clemson University. And they're being held as hostages. And in about January of 1760, the soldiers in that fort murdered the majority of those peacemakers. And for the Cherokee, that was kind of the last straw. That was an overt act of warfare, so they declared war formally. Meanwhile, here in North Carolina, while all that's going on, the governor is fighting with the General Assembly, because the General Assembly is trying to take his royal power away, which isn't even his to give away, it's the king's. But they're to leverage against him, my English is not great today, I apologize, I haven't had enough coffee.
It's okay.
So they decided that they're going to use the safety of everyone living on the frontier as leverage against him. They decided, in the face of this war that's brewing, to reduce the garrison of Fort Dobbs to only 30 soldiers. By the middle of February of 1760, there's dozens of refugees living in the fort, or around the fort, and 30 soldiers. And in the last week of February, these people started to see Cherokee warriors showing up around the fort in very small numbers. Every time they would show up, Hugh Waddell would order soldiers out to attack them and drive them off. And every single time, the Cherokee would just run away without fighting. And they did this day after day after day. And what they were doing is conducting reconnaissance. You know, they're trying to figure out how many soldiers are in the fort. They want to see how they respond to their presence. But they're also conditioning everybody, because for a week of dealing with that, you start to believe that your enemy is not that big of a threat, because they're not sticking around and fighting. They run away at the first sense of opposition. On the night of February 27th, 1760, after about a week of this, these people inside of Fort Dobbs, somewhere around 8 or 9 o'clock at night, heard what they thought were dogs barking down at the spring 300 yards down the hill. They assume it's a couple Cherokee causing the ruckus. So Hugh Waddell, who's a colonel at this point, took one other officer and 8 privates. And in the dark, those 10 guys went down to the spring, and they expected the Cherokee to run away because that's what they do every day, right? When those men got to the spring, they were ambushed by between 60 to 70 warriors. In the dark, the Cherokee opened fire with their guns, and the soldiers immediately dropped to the ground and took cover. Hugh Waddell had instructed his men not to shoot back because you're going to give away your position, you're going to give away your numbers, and you're going to have an empty gun. He told his men to lay and let the Cherokee charge at them. And when they get to within 12 paces, jump up and fire your guns in their faces. Each guy's gun was loaded with that musket ball and 7 buckshot. 12 paces is 2 steps beyond that wall to that wall, okay? So at that close range, you've got shotgun blasts, and they discharge 80 lead projectiles in a wall. And the shock of that stopped the Cherokee attack in its tracks. The soldiers immediately started running for their lives back to the fort, and about midway up the hill, they ran straight into a second group of Cherokee who had snuck in behind them to cut off their retreat. The soldiers fought hand to hand with those warriors, and somehow they managed to break through, and they got all 10 guys back inside of Fort Dobbs alive. The whole battle lasted maybe 15 minutes at the most. But during the course of the battle, 2 of the soldiers were severely wounded. One ended up dying about a month later from his wounds, probably from infection. A young refugee boy was killed outside of the fort's walls. They blamed the Cherokee, but it was pitch black out, and they're firing wildly out of the fort in the dark, so they very easily could have killed him as well. There's no way of knowing. They also claim that they had to have killed at least 10 to 12 Cherokee, but it was dark, so you couldn't be sure. The next day when they investigated, they found only 1 body, but they did find a bunch of blood trails. See, the Cherokee typically carry off their dead and wounded. The Cherokee never attacked Fort Dobbs again. Instead, they started attacking the entire rest of the frontier of North Carolina, wherever there wasn't a fort, which is pretty much everywhere. These attacks were occurring up along the Virginia border above what is today Mount Airy, to the east side of what is today Winston-Salem, almost 50 miles east of here, all the way down the Catawba River Valley, all the way down the Yadkin River Valley, throughout South Carolina, and into northern Georgia. And these attacks raged for about 2 months. In early May of 1760, everything stopped. And that's because the British sent a very small army to South Carolina. They sent 1,200 soldiers under the command of a man named Archibald Montgomery. Colonel Montgomery was sent because he had fought side by side with the Cherokee in 1758 as allies. He knew these men. And they figured he was probably the best guy to send to do 3 things. He had to get the Cherokee to stop attacking the frontier. He had to lift a siege, because the Cherokee had laid siege to a fort that was built near Knoxville, Tennessee, called Fort Loudon. And he had to get the Cherokee to sign a peace treaty. To do that, he marched his army west, and they attacked and burned 10 Cherokee towns. He took a ton of prisoners and treated them well, because his object was not to destroy the Cherokee, it was to end the war and reestablish peace. The Cherokee end up getting most of their hostages released, and Montgomery sends them with messages saying, "You guys are not dealing with South Carolina anymore. It's me, your old friend, and I want my friends back. Let's talk about this and end the war." More than 200 Cherokee were heading out of the mountains down to Fort Prince George to meet with him, and a traitor intercepted them and told them it's a trap. The British are planning to murder all of you. They have smallpox that they want to spread through the villages, and it was all lies. But it wasn't that hard to believe, because 6 months prior to this, at the same fort that the British were sitting in, the Cherokee diplomats had been murdered. So the Cherokee turned around and went home and said, okay, we're going to continue the war. Well, Montgomery decided he needed to march deeper into Cherokee territory and try to make it to Fort Loudon to relieve the siege directly, but just 3 miles south of the modern town of Franklin, North Carolina, which is southwest of Asheville, way about 2.5 hours west of here. The Cherokee defeated his little army in a big battle. And following this major Cherokee victory, they went on and they captured Fort Loudon in in Tennessee, and they went straight back to attacking the frontier. So early in 1761, the British sent a second army to South Carolina. This time it was much larger. And as it marched west, its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Grant, started sending letters to Jeffrey Amherst, his boss in New York City. His first letter contained a line that said, quote, "Were the Cherokee given a voice, we would learn that they are not so much to blame as our subjects." He's telling his boss, we're attacking and punishing the wrong people. Lord Amherst's responses, 7 of them, were basically shut up and follow your orders. So Grant marched his army west. They defeated the Cherokee in a big battle on the 10th of June, 1761, 6 miles south of Franklin, North Carolina. And his army spent the next month burning 18 additional Cherokee towns. They destroyed more than 800 multifamily homes, every single bit of food that they could find stored, and over 1,500 acres of crops. Francis Marion is a very famous Revolutionary War soldier from South Carolina. He was a sergeant during that campaign, and he wrote a poem following the campaign, and one of the lines was, "When we put torch to corn, we wept." Those guys burned the homes and food of more than 5,000 men, women, and children. And at the same time that was happening in western North Carolina, North Carolina and Virginia had a second army in northern Tennessee that was getting ready to invade and do the same thing to the rest of the Cherokee Nation. And this brought the Cherokee to their knees. Before that second invasion launched, they started getting peace. And by December of 1761, peace was reestablished. North Carolina disbanded all of its troops, but they did leave Fort Dobbs standing, and they left a caretaker in charge here. So if there were any other attacks in the future, the locals had the ability to come in here and use the fort for their defense, and they'd have all these weapons at their hands. So, but as soon as the war was over, people really quickly figured out, hey, North Carolina is safe again, land's still cheap. So they started flooding into North Carolina all over again. In 2 years, the frontier moved 70 miles west of Fort Dobbs, which then meant this thing is absolutely useless. So the fort was abandoned in March of 1764, and it was left to rot. Almost immediately, locals started coming in and picking it apart, because it is basically, think about Home Depot or Lowe's opening their doors and saying everything's free. That's what this is.
How much of it
I'm sorry?
is original? Or
none of this structure is original. So the fort was, over time, it rotted and was taken apart. Before 1800, the farmer that owned all of it burned whatever was left.
Oh, okay.
And filled all the holes in, and this whole hilltop was turned into a farm field. His actions, though, preserved everything for us. It preserved everything underground.
Oh, okay.
So all the artifacts. In 1909, the Daughters of the American Revolution acquired the hilltop to preserve it. And in 1965, the first archaeologist came out here, looking for any evidence of the fort, and they immediately, very quickly found not only these ditches, which are all that is today left of the fort, they found that well, they found the cellar, the powder magazine, and since 1965, we have found more than 6,000 artifacts in this little tiny spot.
So pretty obvious the fort was here.
Yeah, there's no disputing it.
No disputing at that point.
But yeah, the artifacts are really cool because we've found stuff. It's every bit of everyday life here. Those guys produce so much trash that we're left with broken pottery, broken glassware, missing buttons, a few coins, broken buckles. But my favorite stuff is the food-related stuff because it shows what these guys are eating every day. And we've got, in our visitor center, we have a few artifacts on display, just a kind of cross-section of what was found. One of them, we found a cow femur that had very clearly been butchered to get at the marrow.
Oh.
We also found peach pits, which that's just kind of cool to think about these soldiers 260 years ago sitting around eating peaches.
Oh, joy. You wouldn't have thought. You wouldn't have thought.
No, I mean, but it's also such a human, much more human thing, enjoying sweet peaches.
I mean,
So,
it's
well,
crazy
come on
though,
inside.